Thank you to all of you for spending your time with us today. We've got a whole bunch of really interesting data to share with you. I'm really excited for our conversation over the next hour. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Nathaniel Stinnett. I am the founder and executive director of the Environmental Voter Project. And today we're going to be discussing what our campaigns are going to look like in 2026. So, we're going to start with a really, really brief introduction of our work at the Environmental Voter Project. For those of you who are new to us, please know I am not going to go into exhaustive detail on all of the aspects of our work. Shannon and Peter will be able to share some resources in the chat if you want to learn more about our work, but this will not be an introductory session to EVP. Instead, what we're going to spend most of our time on is who we are targeting and where throughout 2026, and how all of you can have an impact as volunteers and donors. But let's start with the briefest of introductions to our work at the Environmental Voter Project. What we do is we identify people who care deeply about climate and the environment who don't vote, and then we mobilize them to become more consistent voters. That's it. In fact, a good way to think about us is we aren't in the mind changing business like a lot of groups are. A lot of groups focus on trying to convince people to care more about climate change or the environment. We don't do that. We find the people who are already there, they don't need their minds changed. Instead, they need their behavior changed. We find people who list climate or the environment as their top priority, yet they're not voting, and then we mobilize them to vote. And that might sound like a very focused and specific thing to work on, and it is, but it's not as narrow a niche, let's say, as you might imagine, because it turns out that huge numbers of these super environmentalists don't vote. In fact, what we found was in the 2024 presidential election, 11.2 million super environmentalists didn't vote. That's right, 11.2 million. And let me unpack this number for you for a second. These are all already registered voters. So they've overcome that hurdle. They're registered to vote. They were likely to list climate or the environment as their top priority, yet they didn't cast a ballot a year and a half ago in that supremely important presidential election. 11.2 million. And just to give you a sense of what that looked like in some crucially important swing states, in these 5 swing states that you see here, the numbers of those already registered yet non-voting environmentalists were larger than Donald Trump's margin of victory in each of those states. And as you can see in Georgia, it was 4 times larger than Trump's margin of victory. So this is a really, really big opportunity. We're leaving a lot of potential power on the sidelines whenever there's an election. And that's why we at the Environmental Voter Project are so focused on finding these people and mobilizing them to vote. Very, very briefly, this is how we do it. It's a 4-step process. First, we work with data scientists to build predictive models on voter files. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this here because this isn't an introduction to EVP session. But suffice to say, what these models enable us to do is individually identify people. So not by broad demographic group, but on an individual basis, we identify people who are highly likely to not just care about climate and the environment, but literally listed as their #1 priority over all others. Then we can just cross-reference each of those people's voting histories. And we don't need fancy data scientists for that, because whether you vote or not, that's public record. That's public record. So it's pretty easy for us to then get this collection of people in each state who are really likely to list climate as their top priority, but are unlikely to vote. That lets us go to step two, mobilization. We now have a universe of individuals who don't need their minds changed. They just need their behavior changed. And so then we work with now over 7,000 volunteers to canvass, call, and send postcards to these voters. We as a staff also do direct mail and digital ad campaigns. And we work year round focused on one thing and one thing only, and that is how do we turn these non voters into new voters and new voters into consistent voters? And while we're running these campaigns, we submit all of our work to experiments called randomized control trials. They're like the gold standard of social science experiments. And what these experiments allow us to do is not only measure our impact, but we can isolate which messages work best with which subgroups of these non-voting environmentalists to get them to vote. So we can not only be precise about our impact, but we can really be on the cutting edge of which messages are working to mobilize these climate voters who have been sitting on the sidelines. Step three, habit reinforcement. Our goal is not to win one-off elections, although that does happen sometimes. Rather, our goal is to dramatically increase the number of environmentalists who are voting in election after election after election. And in order to do that, we need to truly change their habits. And we live behavioral science each day. And believe me, if you want to change someone's habit, you can't just talk to them once every 2 years when there's a big, sexy federal election going on. That's not how you change habits. Instead, you need to mobilize them whenever they have an election. And we take that very seriously at EVP. We were active, I kid you not, in over 460 different elections last year. 460. And that's not because each of them were important for climate policymaking. I freely admit the majority of them weren't. But they were all crucial for changing people's behavior. If you are in the habit building business, you need to take every bite at the apple. And that's what we do. When we say we work year round, we really mean it, because ultimately our goal is step four, and that is to change the electorate. Our theory of change at EVP rests on a pretty simple premise, and that is that nothing motivates a politician more than the prospect of winning or losing an election. And so they always end up going where the voters are. And so it's incumbent upon us who want to build power for the climate movement. It's incumbent upon us to dramatically increase the number of voters who list climate as their top priority. Because then, yes, politicians will lead on climate, not out of the goodness of their hearts, not because science says it's a good idea, not even because it will save lives, but because it'll save their jobs. We want to make it politically palatable, politically necessary even, for politicians to lead on climate. And this is how it's done. All right, I said it would be a very brief intro to EVP, and that was about as brief as it comes. If you want more information about what we do, how we do it, and our results, please go to the About page on our website, and we'll share a link in the chat. All right, now let's get in to what we're looking at over the next 9 months. I'm sure none of you need me to tell you what a crucially important moment in time we are living through right now. This midterm election cycle may be the most important one of our country's history. And I know I'm giving you anxiety just by saying that, but we have to recognize that that's true. And we at the Environmental Voter Project have run the numbers, and we've identified some extraordinary opportunities for us as an organization and for you as volunteers and donors over the next 9 months. So here's what we're seeing. Overall, we are going to be targeting 3.4 million individual voters in 2026 across the 21 states that you see there. 3.4 million. What do all of these voters have in common? One, they are already registered to vote. So they've overcome that hurdle, okay? Two, they are highly likely to not just care about climate and the environment, but literally listed as their number one priority over all others. Three, when we look at their public voting histories, we see that they are unlikely to vote in midterm elections. And essentially what that means is they've either never voted in a midterm before or any other lower turnout election. So these are prime mobilization targets. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about where we are going to be working in these 21 states and how that overlaps with some really important political opportunities this year during the midterm cycle. And then I'm going to get into how many of our targets are in these individual states. So first, let's look at the lay of the land for the US Senate. The Cook Political Report, which is a very highly thought of sort of political handicapping site, currently rates the states that you see there as being competitive US Senate races. Now, obviously, things can change. Things can change over the next 9 months, but these are the states where they currently say it'll be a competitive US Senate race. EVP is going to be mobilizing voters in almost all of those states, as you can see there. Almost all of them. The Cook Political Report says that all of these blue states that you're looking at now are competitive gubernatorial races. Some of them are open, some of them have incumbents, but they're going to be very, very competitive. Again, you will see the Environmental Voter Project is mobilizing voters in the overwhelming majority of them. Let's look at the US House. Now, this is kind of an arbitrary cutoff, but we looked at what are the states that have at least two competitive US House races, at least currently rated as competitive. Obviously, there are a lot of states that have one, but they're going to be important, like Nebraska or Alaska or Maine. But these are the states that have at least two. And again, the Environmental Voter Project is mobilizing voters in the overwhelming majority of them. Finally, and this often gets overlooked during midterm election cycles, but it's crucially important, especially as more and more democracy preservation policy is made at the state level and climate policy is made at the state level. These are the states where state legislative houses are so close that they could go one way or the other after this fall's elections. Now you'll see Maine is in light green. That's because only one of their state legislative bodies is in play. The other 6 states are in dark green. That's because both of their state legislative bodies, the state Senate and the state House, are so close that they are in play. And again, EVP is mobilizing voters in the huge majority of those states. And for those of you who are paying close attention, there were 2 states that showed up in every single one of these maps. So competitive US Senate, competitive gubernatorial, at least 2 competitive US House seats, and both of their state legislative bodies were in play. Those 2 states were Michigan and New Hampshire. All right, that's the trivia question for today. All right. As I mentioned, the Environmental Voter Project is targeting 3.4 million individual voters across these 21 states. 3.4 million. And we have identified them as individual voters. I'm going to provide the numbers, you'll see them popping up now, of our targets in every single one of these states. Now, for those of you rather who have been involved with EVP for a while, you might remember in previous years, we literally went through every single state and what we were going to be doing in every single state. We are now in so many states that that would be a 2-hour webinar, so we're not going to do that. However, we do think it's important to provide not only some context for these numbers in particular states, but also how they overlay onto some of the electoral opportunities in these states. So, what I am going to do is not drill down into all 21 of these states, but provide some state specific examples of how you, as donors and volunteers involved in our work, could really make an enormous impact this year in helping us mobilize these 3.4 million potential climate voters. So let's start with Alaska. So, as many of you know, Alaska is going to have an open gubernatorial election. They are going to have a very competitive US Senate race. They are going to have a likely competitive at-large US House race. And it's going to be a state that a lot of people pay attention to this year who otherwise might normally not think that much about Alaska. When we look back at the last 2 years, elections have actually been extraordinarily close in Alaska. So, as an example, 4 years ago, the at-large US House race was decided by barely 5,000 votes. 2 years ago, the at-large US House race was decided by fewer than 8,000 votes. To provide some context, the Environmental Voter Project is going to be targeting almost 25,000 of these already registered low propensity climate voters. That is a huge opportunity. That is a difference making opportunity. This is a really, really big deal in a crucially important state this year. Let's give another example, Arizona. So, both of the state legislative houses are really, really close. They're going to have a super competitive gubernatorial, and at least three, possibly four of their congressional districts are going to be super tight, more likely three. Well, 4 years ago when they had a gubernatorial election, it was decided by 17,000 votes. That is a teeny, teeny margin in Arizona. How many voters are we targeting in Arizona this year? Almost 93,000. 4.5 times that margin from 4 years ago. Again, that is a huge, huge opportunity. And to give you an example of one of the most competitive and important congressional districts there, it's the 6th congressional district, which has sort of the eastern half of Tucson and then moves towards the eastern border of the state. Last time they had an election in that district, it was decided by fewer than 11,000 votes. How many voters are we targeting in that district? Well, almost 25% of our targets for Arizona are in that district. Almost 22,000 of them. Michigan. All right. In Michigan, when they last had a US Senate election a year and a half ago, it was decided by 19,000 votes. We're targeting over 88,000 people in Michigan. Again, a really, really high leverage opportunity for all of you as volunteers and donors. Let's do New Jersey. I know many of you were aware of New Jersey's importance last year, but you might not think of it as being important this year, but it will be. They'll likely have 3 competitive US House seats. One of them, the 7th district, was decided by fewer than 9,000 votes in the last midterm election. EVP has identified almost 50,000 of these already registered, but typically don't vote in midterms, climate first voters. This is a big, big high leverage opportunity in a state that isn't going to get the same amount of attention as some of the states like Georgia or North Carolina or Pennsylvania might end up getting. Finally, I'll just say North Carolina, the last 2 US Senate races they've had have been decided by 120,000 and 95,000 votes. We are targeting over 150,000 voters in North Carolina this year. North Carolina has an open US Senate race, and it is going to be crucially important. Crucially important. These are just some examples of those numbers that I showed you statewide and the context that's really important for them and how high leverage and opportunity we have in so many of these states. Oh, I'm sorry. I always include Pennsylvania because I'm originally from Pennsylvania. So let me give you some Pennsylvania data too. Pennsylvania has four, perhaps even five, depending on how you cut it, competitive US House races. Not to mention they're going to have a gubernatorial, and both houses of their state legislature are really important. In the 7th district, this is up near sort of Berks County, above Bucks County, was decided by 4,000 votes last time they had an election. We're targeting almost 3 times as many that margin. The 10th congressional district, we're targeting almost 4 times their margin in the most recent election. All right. So, what does this mean? Well, obviously, it means when this fall rolls around, your work with the Environmental Voter Project can have an enormous impact. But what I also want to stress to you is that that impact can start right now. It can start right now because there are elections that are already happening that give us those early bites at the apple. Remember when earlier I was talking about the importance of building good habits and turning these non-voters into new voters into consistent voters? Well, that starts right now. We can communicate with many of the voters in these important states in their municipal elections or their early state primaries. And we can start getting them into the habit of voting. And perhaps even more importantly, we can start creating a public record of them having voted in these elections, which means all of the campaigns this fall will see that on public voter files, and they'll start turning out these voters at no cost to us just because we pushed them into the marketplace. And so your work can start now. And so as we think about all of our targets in these many states, I want to highlight to you which of these states are going to present opportunities really, really early on in the year. So let's think about our current month, February, and next month, March. You'll see all of these states, including some crucially important midterm states, are going to be having local and primary elections over the next 6 to 7 weeks. So if you're one of these people who's sitting there thinking, oh man, Texas is going to be important this year, well, it's also important that for their statewide March 3rd primary, we start contacting all of the low propensity voters who we want to have show up on November 3rd. Maybe you're thinking, oh man, North Carolina is going to be important or Iowa is going to be important. Yeah, well, Iowa has local elections on March 10th. I'm sorry, March 3rd. And we want to make sure that those voters are showing up. April. Remember I told you about the importance of Alaska? Well, half of the entire state lives in Anchorage and they have their city elections in April. And so, yeah, that's like about as close as you get to an additional statewide election. And we want to use that to start mobilizing these voters ahead of time. And so these are really crucial opportunities for these states that probably many of you, because I know you're all political junkies, are already thinking about, like, oh, Georgia's going to be important. We gotta make sure that we maximize turnout in Georgia because of the Senate race or the gubernatorial, where you can start in March, you can start in April. And you'll see it keeps on going in May, June, July, August. All of this is even before the fall rolls around. And by the way, the primaries keep happening in September. As some of you know, some states like Massachusetts and New Hampshire have their primaries so late that they're in September. But before most people wake up and start working on the midterms, we're going to be contacting these voters for one, sometimes two, and even three different elections before the fall even starts. And these are precious opportunities for you. First, as a volunteer, but also as a donor. For the moment, I'm going to talk about volunteering opportunities. So, just to give you an example, this is our phone banking calendar for the month of February. And maybe this writing is too small for some of you. That's okay. The whole point I'm trying to make here is that, oh my God, do we have a lot of opportunities? And if you sign up to start phone banking, to start calling these voters we've identified who we want to maximize turnout from on November 3rd, we will train you at the beginning of each phone bank until you're comfortable and ready to go. We will give you proven scripts that we know in previous randomized control trials increase turnout, and we will hold your hands the entire way. Moreover, after the phone bank, we will email you the data from that phone bank so you know that you're having an impact. And here's the best part. Once you get trained, even though we have phone banks all the time, 15 to 20 a month, once you're trained, you get on a list where each week we will email you all of the login credentials you will need to make calls on your own. And so once you're trained, you can then start calling and mobilizing our voters whenever you want. You literally could mobilize voters every single day between now and November 3rd. That's 265 days for those of you who are counting. You could do it every single day. We are also doing door-to-door canvassing in 4 different locations. So Northeastern Virginia, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and Atlanta. For those of you who live in those areas, or for those of you who are willing to travel to those areas, please make sure that you are on our email list. You can also email us at info@environmentalvoter.org if you have an organization, your group wants to get involved in canvassing. But we're door-to-door canvassing in these 4 locations because this is where we have so much what's called canvassable density, which means our targets are not only numerous there, but they're really packed together so that you don't have to walk too long between each door that you knock on. And finally, yes, we will be running at least 4, maybe 5 postcarding campaigns this year. As many of you know, our first postcarding campaign of the year has already closed. We've closed signups for it. But in late March or maybe early April, we'll be announcing our next postcarding campaign. So please stay tuned for that. For those of you who have never postcarded with us, we do it the same way we do phone banks and door-to-door canvassing. And what do I mean by that? I mean, we make it really easy for you to have an impact because we are going to literally send you the postcards we want you to use in the mail because we've already tested them and we know that they work in randomized control trials. We will also obviously send you who you should mail them to, but also exactly what you should write down on them. And then finally, we will send you the stamps. If you let us know you want to get your own stamps, that's fine. But a lot of times people want to be sent stamps, either because they don't want the hassle of going to the post office or they need someone to pay for them, and we're happy to do that. We want to make it as easy as possible for you to have an impact and boost turnout in these states. And whether you're calling, phone banking, door knocking, or doing all 3 of those, I think our team does a fantastic job at maximizing your opportunity to have that impact. All right, now let's talk about funding. We want, we expect, and let's face it, we need this to be the Environmental Voter Project's biggest year ever. I don't think any of you need me to tell you what a frightening moment in time we are all living through. And the next 9 months are pregnant with opportunity, but they also could end very poorly if we don't go all out. And so the Environmental Voter Project is going all out. Not that we ever really take it easy. I don't think anybody would ever claim that we take it easy at the Environmental Voter Project. But our goal this year is to raise and spend not just more money than we ever have, but significantly more money than we ever have. So you'll see our fundraising goal for this year is $5.1 million. What does that mean in the context of what we've done before? Well, it's a hell of a lot more than we did the last time there was a midterm election. In fact, it's a hell of a lot more than we even raised in the presidential election, when everybody and their mother is paying attention to politics. So this would be our biggest year ever by a long shot. However, I think there's some important context here. An additional benefit of us running these randomized control trials, these experiments, is not only can we prove our impact, not only can we figure out which messages work best with which subgroups of our voters, but what we can also do is predict how much we can spend per target voter before we start reaching a point of diminishing returns, before we start spending money and yielding fewer votes per additional dollar spent. And that's relevant for this discussion right now, because even though if we are able to reach for the stars and raise $5.1 million, we are pretty confident that that won't even be halfway to how much we could spend before we hit a point of diminishing returns. To put that another way, we could raise and spend $10.5 million this year, and only then, only when we start spending our $10,500,000 and first dollar, only then will we start creating fewer votes per each dollar spent. And so, yeah, this is a reach, and we need you to help us get there. And we now have over 300 randomized control trials proving how good we are at this, how much of an impact we can have. But we could more than even double that amount and still be getting a really, really efficient return on your investment. And so this is going to be the first of many times that I ask you to invest in our work. We are going to share donation links in the chat. Please donate, and donate generously. You know how important this moment in time is. All I'm asking is that you follow through on what you want to see happen in the electorate this year by investing in these results. And I would like to stress the importance of early donations. Remember some of those examples that I gave earlier of the state-specific contexts for the voters we're targeting? Well, let's revisit those. Remember Alaska, where in the last two statewide at-large U.S. House races, it was decided by 5,000 and then about 8,000 votes. We're targeting almost 25,000 voters in Alaska. Well, we are going to get multiple bites at the apple at these Alaskans before the fall midterm elections. Remember, I brought up that Anchorage election? Well, on April 7th, we can target almost half of our voters. Actually, a little bit more than half, like 50.1%, I think. So 12,282 of our targets are voting in that Anchorage municipal election. We don't just want to call them, we want to send them mail and digital ads. This is a precious opportunity to turn them into brand new voters before all of the expensive TV ads start this fall. Then we get another bite at the apple for the statewide primary in August. And then finally, in November 3rd, again, we're going to mobilize all of these voters, but in many ways, our most efficient play, our best opportunity, our cheapest conversion rates are going to be on April 7th and August 26th. Give you another example in Michigan. In early May, Multiple counties, probably 7 or 8 different counties, are going to have elections in Michigan. And we predict we'll probably end up targeting over 30,000 of our voters in those elections. Then in August, they're going to have their statewide primaries. So again, these are two crucially important bites at the apple in a state where both of their state legislative houses are in play, their governor's mansion's in play, their U.S. Senate seat is in play, and they've got 3, maybe 4 competitive U.S. House races. But we can't take full advantage of these early, super efficient opportunities unless we get that funding, unless we get the funding. And so, again, give generously, not as a favor to us. We're not a charity. We are an arm of your values. We are an extension of the change that you want to see in the electorate this year. And we've got the results to prove it. This is an opportunity for all of you, and I can't wait to work with all of you on it. All right. In closing, I want you all today to start making that commitment. Start making that commitment to make a difference. If you are interested in volunteering with us, please go to environmentalvoter.org/get-involved. We're going to put a link in the chat. You can sign up. And again, I can brag about this because Shannon has her camera off now and you won't see her face turn red. Shannon and her team are so extraordinarily good at this. They make it so easy for you to be onboarded and trained and feel comfortable and then communicate with those voters. And then when you're done, they communicate with you about how many people on your phone bank or how many people on your canvassing shift or how many people on your postcarding campaign ended up contacting voters. And then months after the election, when voter files are updated and we get results, we communicate with you about those as well. We make it so easy for you to have an impact. And it's understandable if some of you are scared to volunteer. Obviously, it's not always fun to communicate with voters. But you know what else isn't fun? Our democracy falling apart and our climate falling apart. This is the moment for all of us to start doing hard things and really dedicating ourselves to them. Second way you can make a difference. If you want someone from the Environmental Voter Project to present to your group, either as a fundraiser or getting them involved in volunteering, we do have minimum limits and it depends on the time of day and things like that. But please reach out to us. We love partnering with other organizations, and we realize that sometimes you want to learn about what those partnership opportunities are before you commit. Email us at info@environmentalvoter.org, and we would love to connect with you about that. Third, don't just donate, but consider becoming a monthly donor. This is so important because every week, sometimes 2 or 3 times a week, I'm revising our budget. And I'm trying, it's like a game of Twister where I've got like one foot on one thing and another hand on another because I'm trying to make sure that our midterm mobilizations are going to be really robust. Yet, remember what I just finished telling you about, all of these really efficient early opportunities. And so I'm trying to fundraise for multiple things at the same time. And the best tool that we have are these monthly recurring donations, where we know that each month we're going to get $10 from this person, or $100 from this person, or $1,000 from this person, or $3 from that person. This enables us to plan ahead and make smarter decisions. So please, please, please become a monthly donor. And we will put a link in the chat. And then finally, if you would like to host an online fundraiser for the Environmental Voter Project, again, please email us. It would be my pleasure to meet with you and your colleagues and your friends over Zoom, describe our work, answer their questions, and then it's up to them whether they want to donate or not. I know this isn't like a candidate campaign where you already know what's going on and you're just going to support a particular candidate. People want to have our work explained to them first. What I'm asking you for is the opportunity. We would love to meet with your friends and colleagues and neighbors or activist group to raise funds for our crucial campaigns this year. So in closing, we are now actually 37 weeks and 6 days, but we'll round up to 38 weeks. We're 38 weeks away from the midterm elections. You are here because you know how important they are. You are here because you want to make a difference. And so please, right now, start thinking about how you are going to give your all to the next 38 weeks, because we ain't going to get them back. And please, please, please use this moment to invest in our work and to sign up to volunteer, because we are having an impact right now. And we want you to enjoy having that impact with us. All right. I can't wait to get to your questions. Thank you all. I see that you've been lighting up the Q&A folder, and so I can't wait to hear what we've got, Shannon.
You are not going to be bored, Nathaniel.
All
Everyone was
right.
taking notes, paying attention, sharing tons of good information. So I also just appreciate everyone who sent those in. All right. This this might be my favorite question that we got, especially since you were just talking about donations and monthly donations. But we're also asking for volunteers. If we're relying so much on volunteer work, where are these donations going?
Yes, great, great question. All right. So we contact voters in 5 different ways. The first 3 is using volunteers. The second 2 is done by staff. So volunteers do door-to-door canvassing, phone banking, and volunteer postcards. Then we as a staff run direct mail and digital ad campaigns. So first, let's talk about the volunteer stuff. Even though these are volunteers, we still need to pay for server time and predictive dialer time for phone banking. That's probably going to cost us north of $200,000 just this year. Just that server time to run those volunteer phone banks. For door-to-door canvassing, we need to pay for the literature that is used for those door-to-door canvasses. For volunteer postcarding campaigns, we need to pay for printing those postcards. We need to pay for sending them to anywhere from 400 to 500 volunteers for each of those 5 different campaigns. And we need to pay for all of the postage. That as well is probably going to cost us $250,000, maybe $300,000 this year. And all of that doesn't even mention, to support all of those volunteer voter turnout efforts, we need to rent access to voter files in each state. We need to build predictive models to identify these voters. And we have a very small staff of only 5, but we need to pay staff to make sure that it is as rewarding an experience and as impactful an experience as you could possibly have. So that's just what the money goes to for those volunteer interventions. Then we as a staff also send direct mail and digital ads to these voters. And those are also very expensive. They're going to be multiple millions of dollars. And it's important that we do that because, one, those work really, really well. We've got tons of experiments and reports that you can see on our website proving that our direct mail and digital ads really send turnout through the roof. But also, two, there are some people who can't be reached by phone. They can't be reached at the door, or just sending them a postcard isn't going to be enough. And so we also want to hit them with that direct mail and digital ads. The final thing that I'll just say, and this wasn't alluded to or asked in the question, but I'm proud of it. So I'm going to say it anyway. Ever since we finished our proof of concept, sort of our 1 year pilot program back in 2016. So ever since we launched for good in 2017, every single year, EVP is proud to say that we have spent over 90% of our money on voter mobilization. Over 90%. I can't think of any other organization that does that. And we are very, very proud of that. Very, very proud of that. But really, really good question, because I don't blame you. Sometimes people are thinking like, well, they ask for all of these volunteers. What are they spending all that money on? And so thank you. Thank you for asking that. I'm sure you weren't the only one wondering.
Yeah, and that was Jamie. I should have mentioned Jamie asked, so that was a great question. All right. This one, Nathaniel, you're used to answering, but the states change a little bit every year. Why aren't we in all the swing states? Why are there some of the states that you didn't talk about as ones that were mobilizing voters in this year?
Yes. Great, great question. So just so people can remember what states we're active in, I'm going to pull up this map here. So first, you'll see that we're active in a whole lot of swing states, okay? We are active in a whole lot of swing states. But there's no doubt that there are some states that are going to be important this year where we do not work. Wisconsin, Ohio, California, Minnesota. That is by design. It's by design. We choose which states to work in based on three criteria. So first, where is there a disproportionately large population of non-voting environmentalists? We need to have lots of targets. If we don't have lots of these non-voting environmentalists to mobilize, it kind of doesn't matter how good we are. We're not going to have an impact, right? So like if there are 20 non-voting environmentalists in Idaho and we get them all to vote, well, who cares? Like that's not going to change anything. And so one of the reasons we don't work, really the big reason we don't work in Wisconsin, is not because it's not an important state. Dear God, of course Wisconsin's an important state. But there aren't that many non-voting environmentalists there. And so when people ask us to work in Wisconsin, I tell them, you absolutely should worry about Wisconsin. And that's why you should support another organization. And some people can't believe that I tell people not to donate to us. But the truth is, I'm only doing this. Shannon's only doing this. All of us are only doing this because we care deeply about the health of our climate and our democracy, and we want to have an impact. And there are all of these states where we can have a huge impact, and there are some where we can't. And we want to be honest about that. All right. A second criteria that we use to decide where to work is we want to have active election cycles, not just in even years, but in odd years, because we like getting those multiple bites at the apple, because we want to change people's behavior over time. Lots of these states have elections every year. A state like Georgia, where everything goes to a runoff, we could maybe talk to some of our targets 5, 6, 7 times a year, even in odd years. But there are some states, like say Oregon, where there are lots of non-voting environmentalists, but they don't have any odd year elections. And so we would only be able to talk to our voters twice every 2 years. And that's just not enough for us to have a real impact on changing the electorate. And finally, the third criteria we use when deciding where to work is we don't just care about moving climate policy on the federal level, although of course we care about it there. We also care about the state and local level. And so, yes, we are in some red states and some blue states because in a state like Louisiana, you change the municipal government in a state and they can tweak the zoning code and literally like push a petrochemical plant out of business. Or in a place like Nebraska, where there are municipally owned utilities, you juice turnout in a 2,000 person election for a municipal utility board. And just by spending $10,000 in an election, we might be able to shut down a coal fired power plant and save 3,000 lives. That is an enormously high leverage use of your time and money. And so that's why often you will see that we work in these blue states and red states. It's because there are these opportunities, not just in US House districts, but at the state and local level. But I think what you are really getting at is, what about these federal swing states, these Wisconsins, these Ohio's? I won't disagree with you that those are important states, but we take very seriously that we are able to have an impact where we work. And included in that means we need to be honest with ourselves and honest with you that there are also some states where we can't have as big an impact.
Awesome. Thank you, Lisa and Amy, plus I think maybe half a dozen others who had some similar questions on that vein, Nathaniel. So good bang for your buck on that answer. That really relates well to our next question, which is from Kathleen, which I'll give the sidebar. Join one of our Tuesday phone banks, folks. You will hear from Kathleen. She's one of our superstar volunteer leaders, and she'll get you going. Kathleen has a question. What are our thoughts on cities like New York City or even some states that are now shifting their election schedules to be more exclusively lined up with even years? How does that change our operations there?
Yeah, so it's a great question, Kathleen. Uh, First of all, let me just say, as someone who cares about good government and responsive government, I think that's good policy. If I were governor of a state, dear God, please let that never be the case. But if I was, or if I was a state legislator, I would try to do that because you want more people to vote in municipal elections. You want that. I think that is good for the health of our democracy. But as Kathleen was probably alluding to, and as I mentioned earlier, that's not necessarily good for those of us in the habit building business. We want lots of different elections, many of which have really small turnout, so that we can use those opportunities to make people better and better voters. In states where they change the election calendars like that, it means we will have fewer opportunities to talk to those voters. Now, if it happens in just a few different municipalities in the state, but elsewhere in the state they keep the same odd year cycle, it's probably not going to change anything. But if it's a really big change, might that change our decision making as to whether it makes sense to work in that state? Yeah, it's possible. But I don't want to alarm anybody because the truth is, every 2 years, we completely reevaluate whether it makes sense for us to be working in our states. And it is always possible that we will not only grow into new states, but decide that it's time to stop working in particular states. That is always a possibility because our North Star is not, let's just keep going. No, our North Star is to be having an impact and solving a problem. And if it ever gets to a point where nationally, or at least in specific states, we feel like we are having diminishing returns, or there is no longer a problem for us to solve in that state, we're going to stop working in that state. Because ultimately, boy, would it be nice if we could put ourselves out of business, or at least start putting ourselves out of business. I did not start the Environmental Voter Project because some of my friends wanted a job. No way in hell. You could ask my wife how crazy I thought I was and everybody thought I was to start a nonprofit from scratch. No, we're in the problem solving business. And so, yeah, it is always a possibility that we could back out of our state, either out of a state, either because they're tweaking the election calendar or what's more likely, because we're seeing a precipitous drop off in the number of non-voting environmentalists in that state. If we see that, it's very likely we'll pull out of a state because they won't need us there anymore.
All right. I'm going to slightly rephrase this question from Bruce, which is there's some reports that in 2026, the less progressive candidates or the less progressive side of the movement, maybe anti-climate interests, will be way better funded than progressive candidates or those who are more climate friendly. What can we do about that?
Well, uh, first I will just say that as an organization, the Environmental Voter Project doesn't say, oh, support this kind of Democrat or this kind of Republican or this kind of candidate, period. It's just not something we get involved with for a whole bunch of legal reasons. But what I can say, as someone who not only has been involved in electoral politics now for almost 2 decades, but spends an enormous amount of time studying how electorates change, is anybody who thinks they know what makes an electable candidate is either really dumb or really dishonest. You just like there have been times when even I think like, oh yeah, this person is more electable in this way. It is so tempting to read those tea leaves, but the truth is, we still live in especially a primary election environment where there's so much fluidity that it is really hard to be confident that a certain type of candidate is more electable than another. And so that's a very long, winding way for me to get to answering your question, Bruce, which is you should invest in the candidate that you want to see win. Period. Period. And not just because if more people do that, it will be more likely that actually the people who win elections are more responsive to a larger number of people because people aren't like doing this weird 7-dimensional game theory and like trying to figure out who should win a primary rather than like who they want to win a primary. But also because even if your candidate loses, it is going to change what gets spoken about. Because even if you back a candidate that, you know, ends up not winning, they are then going to have more fuel to talk about the things that you want them to talk about. And that's going to change the dynamic of the primary and ultimately the general. And so I think that is so, so important to understand. The final thing I will just say, Bruce, is we all know how much money there is in politics. Although, boy, would the Environmental Voter Project like more of it, okay? But at the end of the day, money is only good for one thing in politics, and that is getting votes. It all comes down to votes. Whether you are a super PAC spending a gazillion dollars, or whether you are an individual who's committing to $3 per month to a candidate or to a nonprofit, what it all eventually gets spent on is trying to either persuade voters or mobilize voters. And so at the end of the day, yeah, most of the people on this call probably don't have as much money to throw around as the Koch network does, or as certain super PACs do. And that's okay, because you know what they don't have? An army of potential voters sitting on the sidelines who could be mobilized to show up. What they need to do is persuade people to change their minds, which is a hell of a lot more expensive and a hell of a lot harder. Now, they've become really good at it, but We actually have a slightly lighter lift because all we need to do is get our people to show up. Now, I won't claim that's easy. Of course, it's not easy, but it is easier and it is doable, and we have proven it. So, our time is done. I want to close by thanking all of you for being part of our work. I know we don't have our results yet from last year. We're still waiting for voter files to be updated in about 2/3 of our states. We will be reporting back to you on all of those randomized control trials, hopefully in about 6 to 8 weeks. But we did want to tell you that we had already crunched the numbers. We had already identified who we're going to be targeting for the midterms. And most importantly, that the midterms have already begun. We are already communicating with these voters. So please, all of you, before this Zoom ends, go into the chat, click on the Get Involved link, and sign up to volunteer. Do it. You are here for a reason. Not just because you're curious, not just because you like Zoom meetings, but because you care deeply about addressing our democracy crisis and our climate crisis. And please also go into the chat and click on that donation link. Sign up for a monthly donation. This is the way that we can spend your money in the wisest way possible and be as generous as you can. We all know, we all know how important the next 9 months are. So thank you. Thank you, Shannon. Thank you, Peter, for also helping in the chat and the Q&A. And thank you, all of you, the hundreds of you who joined us. I could not ask for a better group of people to be working with over the next 9 months. We're going to do this, folks. Take care.